The day Karen called 911 on my farmer's market stand was the day I realized just how far the HOA would go to flex power they didn't even have. It was a Saturday morning like any other, sun climbing over the rooftops, birds chirping, neighbors sipping coffee on porches. I had just finished setting up my modest wooden stand at the corner of Maple Creek and Sycamore Drive right on the edge of my own property. Nothing fancy. Just a tidy row of crates stacked with heirloom tomatoes, honey from my backyard hives, and a few jars of pickled okra my grandma taught me to make. I'd been doing this every weekend for nearly 6 months, ever since I got my state-issued cottage food permit. The neighborhood loved it. Most of them anyway. Then came the click, click, click of heels on concrete. My stomach sank before I even looked up. "Mr. Silas Montgomery," came the shrill, nasal voice I knew too well. "Just what do you think you're doing?" There she was. Marlene Whitaker, HOA board president, walking toward me with her over-bleached bob, oversized sunglasses, and a clipboard clutched to her chest like a holy relic. Marlene had that look people get when they're too used to getting their way tight-lipped, nose up, convinced the world spins just slightly off because someone like me exists. "Morning, Marlene," I said, wiping my hands on my apron. "Selling produce." "Like I do every Saturday." "This is a residential neighborhood, not a commercial district," she snapped, jabbing her pen at my table. "You are in violation of HOA Code 13.7, no unauthorized commerce on community grounds." I pointed to the stake in the grass, right behind the stand. "This is my yard, Marlene, my property, not communal. Also, I have a permit from the state. I'm well within my rights." She squinted at the paper I showed her, barely glancing at the bold letters from the Department of Agriculture. "We'll see about that." I watched her march off, heels stabbing the sidewalk like she was trying to punish the earth itself. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 10 minutes later, I was handing a jar of honey to little Missy Jenkins and her mom when a police cruiser rolled up beside my stand. Lights off, but the engine growling like a warning. 2 officers stepped out, both of them looking more confused than concerned. "Sir," the taller one said, "we got a call about unauthorized vending and a possible health code violation." I sighed and handed him the same laminated permit I'd shown Marlene. "Cottage food license," I said, "issued by the state." "I don't sell anything that requires refrigeration, and everything's labeled and sealed. I even took the food safety course." The officer scanned the permit, nodded, and handed it back. "You're good," he said. "Sorry to bother you." Just as they turned to leave, Marlene came storming out of her garage like a banshee, phone still in hand. "Wait, you're just going to let him get away with it? He's disrupting the aesthetic of the neighborhood." "This is a clear violation of our bylaws," the shorter officer raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, he's on his own property and this is a state-permitted operation. There's no crime here." Marlene's mouth twisted, searching for a comeback. "He's lowering property values," the taller cop chuckled. "With tomatoes, they left. She didn't." By the time the afternoon sun hit the pavement, Marlene had already canvassed the neighborhood with flyers warning about the unauthorized produce operation. She even went door to door trying to get signatures to shut down the rogue fruit stand. But here's the thing. People liked the stand. They liked me. They liked the honey and the fact that their kids could learn what a real tomato tasted like, and they were tired of Marlene's antics. The next morning, I woke up to find a basket on my porch. Inside were muffins, a little thank you card, and over a dozen signatures on a note that read, "We support Silas's stand. HOA needs to back off." I wasn't looking for a fight, but Marlene wasn't going to let it go. Monday morning, I got the first fine, $100. For unauthorized signage. I stared at the letter and laughed. The only sign I had was a wooden board that said "Fresh Veggies" in my own handwriting, propped up against the table on my grass. I sent a formal appeal to the HOA board and attached a copy of my state permit again, along with a photo of the sign and a copy of the relevant zoning laws. I knew the rules. I'd read them twice before I ever set up that stand. 3 days later, I got another fine, $200. This time, the charge was creating a public nuisance. My patience started to unravel. I called a meeting, not with the HOA, with the neighborhood. I set up chairs on my lawn, brought out lemonade and cookies, and handed out copies of every permit, law, and violation notice Marlene had sent me. I even printed out the police report that said no action was taken. Look, I told them, this isn't about a tomato stand anymore. This is about control. Marlene doesn't like that I didn't ask her for permission to do something I'm allowed to do. A few folks clapped. A few more nodded. Then something unexpected happened. Susan Kensington, one of the quieter neighbors on the block, stood up. She was soft-spoken, always polite, and never involved in the HOA drama. "I used to run a daycare out of my home," she said. "Marlene shut me down with fake complaints to the fire marshal and then fined me until I couldn't afford to stay open. That got people talking. Apparently, I wasn't the first. Or the second. Marlene had fined a disabled veteran for installing a ramp. She'd threatened a single mom for painting her shutters the wrong shade of blue, even though the paint was pre-approved. And years ago, she tried to evict a family for putting up Christmas lights before Thanksgiving. It was like the floodgates opened. People had been afraid to speak up, worried about retaliation. But now they were mad, and they weren't just mad at Marlene. They were mad at the HOA board that rubber-stamped everything she did, so we made a plan, not revenge, not yet. First, we needed proof. I installed a security camera pointed at my yard and the street. Nothing fancy, just enough to catch anyone snooping around. Susan dug up old emails and letters she'd saved from her daycare shutdown. Jacob, the disabled vet, still had photos of the fines and the ramp she made him tear down. We started collecting, documenting, organizing, because if Marlene wanted a war over squash and mason jars, she was about to get one, and this time the neighborhood wasn't backing down. By the following weekend, I had 2 new additions to my market stand. A laminated copy of my cottage food permit nailed to the front of the table, and a sleek motion-activated camera perched on the porch rail, angled to catch the entire street view. I wasn't leaving any more room for intimidation or lies. The neighborhood was shifting. I felt it in the way people walked a little slower past my yard, how they lingered longer at my table not just to buy but to talk, to ask what they could do. There was a cautious energy in the air, like the block was holding its breath, waiting to see what Marlene would try next. She didn't make them wait long. Monday morning, I received a certified letter shoved into my mailbox so forcefully, it crumpled the top flap. Inside was a cease and desist drafted by a law firm I'd never heard of, claiming I was operating a commercial enterprise in direct violation of HOA rules, and that further noncompliance would result in escalated legal consequences, including but not limited to property liens. I read it 3 times. Then once more, slowly. The HOA had retained an attorney. I called the number listed at the bottom. A receptionist answered and transferred me to a junior associate who sounded like he'd just graduated law school last month. When I asked him what zoning ordinance I was violating, he stammered for a moment before admitting he hadn't actually reviewed the state's cottage food laws. "You understand," I said, keeping my tone level, "that filing a false legal threat can qualify as harassment, right?" He went quiet again and then mumbled something about checking with his supervisor before hanging up. Something wasn't adding up. The HOA collected dues, sure, but not enough to casually hire outside counsel. Unless they weren't paying for it with HOA funds. That afternoon, I walked down to City Hall and requested the last 3 annual financial disclosures for the Maple Creek HOA. As a resident, I was legally entitled to them. The clerk behind the counter raised an eyebrow but handed them over without a word. I sat down at one of the public desks and started going line by line, and there it was, an entry from 4 months ago. Legal consulting services $4,200. The payee: Whitaker and Associates, LLC. I stared at the page. That name sounded familiar. A quick internet search confirmed it. Whitaker and Associates was run by Marlene's cousin in Clearwater. No office, no storefront, just a P.O. box and a Gmail address. I took photos of the documents with my phone and forwarded them to Susan Kensington, who had quietly taken on the role of our unofficial investigator. She replied within the hour, confirming that under Florida HOA statutes, any expenditure over $500 required a board vote recorded in meeting minutes, and no such vote had occurred in over a year. Marlene had funneled HOA money to a relative under the table. At this point, it wasn't just about produce anymore. This was misappropriation of funds, possibly fraud. "Let's do it right," Susan said when I called her that night. "We gather, we document, we present it legally, no shouting matches, no pettiness, just facts." She was right. We weren't going to stoop. We'd present the truth the way Marlene couldn't spin her way out of. We spent the next 2 weeks building a silent case. Susan compiled a timeline of every major financial transaction over the past 3 years. Jacob tracked down other residents who'd received questionable fines or threats. Even Missy Jenkins' mom, a paralegal, joined the group and helped us organize everything into a formal complaint. Then came the break we didn't expect. On a Thursday morning, my camera picked up movement at 3:42 a.m., a figure darting across my lawn, crouching low. They approached the stand, now covered for the night, and pulled something from their coat, a small canister, spray paint. By the time sunlight broke, the front of my table read "Food Poison" in red block letters. I reviewed the footage 3 times. The hoodie was pulled low, but the gait was undeniable. It was Marlene's husband, Rick. I downloaded the footage and emailed it to the local precinct with a written statement. Then I printed stills and added them to our growing binder. The police arrived that evening, quiet and professional. They knocked on the Whitakers' door. Marlene answered, all pearls and perfume, her usual mask of civility snapped on tight. But when they asked if Rick was home, her expression twitched. He came to the door within minutes, reeking of paint thinner. They didn't cuff him, but they did ask him to come down for questioning. Marlene tried to block the doorway, but one of the officers stepped between her and her husband and calmly said, "Ma'am, this isn't negotiable." Word spread fast. By morning, everyone on the block had seen the graffiti, and by noon, they'd all seen the footage. The following Saturday, I didn't open the stand. Not because I was scared. I was preparing for something bigger. That afternoon, we held a neighborhood assembly in Susan's backyard. Every chair was filled, lawn chairs, folding chairs, even a few people standing behind the fence. Over 30 families showed up. Susan stood beside a folding table stacked with documents and addressed the crowd. "We've compiled over 24 instances of unauthorized financial activity, selective enforcement of rules, and most recently criminal vandalism tied directly to the HOA president's household." She handed out copies of the timeline and financial records. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People flipped pages, pointed to entries, whispered to spouses. "We're not just here to complain," she continued. "We're here to act." Under Florida Statute 720.303, residents can call for a special election with a petition signed by 15% of homeowners. She held up a clipboard. "We've got 28%. A cheer erupted. "We'll deliver the petition to the HOA office on Monday," Jacob said. "After that, they have 14 days to schedule the recall vote. If they don't, we can take it to the county." No one clapped this time. It was dead quiet, focused, determined. 2 days later, I personally handed the petition to the HOA secretary, an older gentleman named Frank who looked visibly relieved. "About time," he muttered under his breath. "She's been out of control for years." The board tried to delay the vote, citing procedural gaps. But Missy's mom had already filed a notice with the county's HOA oversight department. They weren't getting out of it. The vote was scheduled for the last Saturday of the month. In the meantime, the police concluded their investigation. Rick was charged with misdemeanor vandalism and placed under a restraining order that prohibited him from setting foot on my property. That meant he couldn't attend the vote unless it was moved to a neutral location, which we demanded and got. The community center across town hosted the recall election. Each homeowner signed in, cast a paper ballot, and dropped it in the secure box. The tension was thick, but no one spoke above a whisper. When the counting finished, the results were unanimous. Not a single vote in Marlene's favor. She stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, lips pursed like she'd bitten into something rotten. For once, she had nothing to say. Frank, now acting board president, stood and cleared his throat. Effective immediately, Marlene Whitaker is removed from all HOA duties. An interim board will be selected next week, and a full audit of finances will begin under third-party supervision. The room erupted not with cheers, not with gloating, but with a collective exhale. Relief. As we walked out into the evening air, Susan turned to me. "You still gonna sell your tomatoes?" I smiled. "I think I'll build a bigger table." The sun had barely broken through the clouds when I heard the knock, a slow, deliberate rhythm that didn't belong to any neighbor I knew. I opened the door to find two men in charcoal suits standing on my porch. One of them held a black binder, the other flashed a badge. "Mr. Silas Montgomery?" the taller one asked. I nodded, heart skipping. "I'm Agent Rivas, this is Agent Dalton. We're with the Florida Department of Financial Services." "Mind if we come in?" I stepped aside, still barefoot, the hardwood cool under my feet. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as they sat at my kitchen table, Agent Rivas opened the binder, revealing a series of color-coded spreadsheets, bank statements, and scanned receipts. "We've been investigating several HOA boards in the region for misuse of funds," Rivas said, tapping a red highlighted cell. "Your HOA came to our attention after a concerned resident filed a complaint and attached documentation showing discrepancies in financial reporting." I leaned forward. "Was it Susan?" Agent Dalton gave a tight nod. "We can't discuss the identity of complainants, but the evidence was detailed, enough for us to subpoena the HOA's full financial records." I glanced at the documents spread before us, and Rivas flipped another page. Over $75,000 in unapproved expenditures over the last 2 years, most of it funneled through shell vendors. One of them, Whitaker and Associates, doesn't exist in any certified business registry. We traced it to a prepaid P.O. box in Clearwater. Payments were issued on a quarterly basis, each just under the reporting threshold that would trigger automatic board review. Dalton added, "That's a common laundering tactic. Keep amounts small, spread them out, and hope no one looks too close." I blinked. "So what now?" Rivas closed the binder. "We're moving forward with a formal investigation. That includes interviewing all current and former board members, freezing HOA accounts, and issuing forensic audits. We'll also be coordinating with the state attorney's office. If we find criminal intent, this could lead to felony charges." They left just as quickly as they arrived, leaving behind a business card and a sense that something far bigger had been set in motion. By midweek, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet tension. A state-issued notice was posted on the HOA office door. "Operations suspended pending financial audit." Frank, the interim president, had stepped down the day before citing health concerns. We couldn't blame him. The pressure was mounting, and nobody wanted to be caught holding the bag. Susan took over in the interim, but she made it clear she wasn't in it for the long haul. "I'm a researcher, not a politician," she said during a small meeting in her living room. "But I'll keep things transparent until we vote in a new board." She wasn't kidding about transparency. By Friday, she'd set up a neighborhood website password protected with all current HOA documentation, expenditures, and updates from the DFS investigation. It was clean, factual, and impossible for anyone to twist. That weekend, I reopened my stand. The table was sturdier now, made from reclaimed barn wood I'd sourced from an old friend in Tallahassee. I added a chalkboard sign with the week's offerings and set a tip jar off to the side with a note. All proceeds this week go to the Community Legal Fund. People showed up in waves. Not just for the produce, but to talk, to share, to ask questions. It wasn't just about the market anymore. It was about reclaiming something that had been taken, an intangible sense of control. Around noon, a silver sedan pulled up at the curb. A woman stepped out mid-30s, pressed slacks, clipboard in hand. She walked straight up to me. "Mr. Montgomery, that's me. I'm Lisa Gentry, investigator for the County Zoning Enforcement Office. I'm here to conduct a site review of your vendor operation per request from an anonymous complaint." "Let me guess," I said. Tall, bleach blonde, fond of clipboards, she cracked a faint grin, then turned serious. "I'm not here to shut you down. I just need to verify compliance. Go right ahead." She walked the perimeter of the stand, checked the placement of my sign, the distance from the sidewalk, and took photos of the permit posted at the front. Then she asked a few questions about product storage, labeling, and customer traffic. I answered everything clearly. She nodded, made some notes, and finally said, "You're fully compliant. Whoever filed the complaint clearly didn't understand the zoning code." I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. She gave me a copy of the report and drove off. Later that evening, while sorting through leftover produce, I got a call from Susan. "You're going to want to hear this," she said. She explained that the DFS had just discovered a second fake vendor in the HOA's financial trail, a landscaping company that billed for monthly services no one had ever seen performed. The name? Green Horizon Solutions. No records. No business license. But the payments, all in neat monthly increments, had been approved by Marlene's digital signature. "Where did the money go?" I asked. "That's the kicker," Susan said. "They traced the account to a bank in Georgia. It's in Rick Whitaker's name." I let that sink in. "This isn't just shady bookkeeping," she added. "This is organized embezzlement. They're coordinating with the Attorney General's office now. If charges go through, we're talking mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering." The thought of it all, how deep the rot went, made my stomach churn. But it also lit a fire. "We need a new board," I said. "One that won't just sit in folding chairs once a month and nod while someone else makes decisions. We need people who actually understand the bylaws, the finances, everything." Susan agreed. "I'll help facilitate the election." "But we need candidates." I spent the next few days knocking on doors, ones I hadn't reached before. I talked to Charles Ramos, a retired accountant who'd quietly lived on the corner for 10 years. He agreed to run for treasurer. I convinced Leela, a nurse who commuted 3 hours a day, to step in as secretary. She had a sharp eye for detail and a low tolerance for nonsense. And for president, I nominated Jacob. He hesitated at first. "I fix cars, Silas. I'm not exactly board material. You know what it's like to be bulldozed by people with no empathy," I said. "And you've got grit. That's what we need right now." He agreed, reluctantly. By the time election day came around, the community center was packed again. This time, the mood was lighter, focused. People brought their kids, their dogs, their folding chairs. Ballots were handed out, and within an hour the new board was elected unanimously. Jacob stood before the group, hands tucked into the pockets of his jeans. "I'm not a politician," he said, "but I believe in fairness. I've lived here long enough to see what happens when power gets used to punish instead of protect. That ends now. We're going to rebuild this HOA, not just in name but in purpose." Leela and Charles flanked him, both nodding. "And we'll be holding open forums every month," Leela added. "No closed-door meetings, no surprises." Afterward, as people filtered out into the parking lot, I stood by my truck, arms crossed, watching the laughter and conversations ripple through the crowd. For the first time in months, maybe years, this place felt like a neighborhood again. That night, I finally took a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, but the final twist came the next morning. A knock. Again. This time, it was a man in a Navy windbreaker with a U.S. Postal Inspection badge clipped to his chest. "Mr. Montgomery?" "Yes." I'm following up on a joint investigation with the Department of Financial Services. We have confirmation that several HOA notices, fines, warnings, even legal threats were sent through the mail under false pretenses. That qualifies as mail fraud. We're coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a subpoena, not for me, for Marlene. She was being indicted. As I stood on my porch, sun beginning to rise over the rooftops, I realized this wasn't just about tomatoes anymore. It was about truth, and what happens when a community finally stops being silent. And Marlene. She picked the wrong person to try and scare into silence. It was a drizzly Tuesday when Marlene Whitaker was formally arrested. Not the kind of dramatic spectacle you'd expect, no handcuffs in the front yard or shouting neighbors filming with their phones, but a quiet, clinical pickup at her lawyer's office downtown. The police had been building the case quietly, piece by piece, and now that the postal inspectors were involved, the charges stretched further than anyone in our neighborhood could have imagined. The news broke like thunder in a slow sky. First, a local blog picked up the story: HOA president indicted for mail fraud and embezzlement, and within hours it was on the regional news. They even aired a still from her driver's license next to a blurry image of my produce stand. The anchor's voice was neutral, but the segment ended with a throwaway line that made my jaw tighten. Residents say the dispute started over tomatoes. No, it never started with vegetables. It started with ego, with control, with someone who thought a clipboard gave her the right to run lives like a private fiefdom. But the damage was done. The neighborhood's name was now linked to a statewide investigation, and even though we'd removed Marlene and installed a new board, we were still operating in the shadow of what she'd done. 2 days after the arrest, I walked into the community center and found Jacob pacing near the coffee urn, arms folded, expression unreadable. "They're freezing the HOA's insurance account," he said without looking up. Apparently, the old board authorized a liability policy through one of Marlene's relatives. It was fake, no coverage, not even a real underwriter. I ran a hand along the back of my neck. So if someone had slipped on the sidewalk or fallen off a rotted swing set, we'd be paying out of pocket, Jacob finished. The entire neighborhood. Leela arrived a few minutes later, carrying a red folder fat with papers. She laid it on the table and opened it to the first page. "Here's everything we've compiled for the Attorney General's office." They're requesting statements from every homeowner who received a fabricated fine or threatening letter. We need to submit it by the end of the week. I pulled up a chair. "You want me to go door to door?" "No," she said. "They're coming here Saturday." 2 prosecutors, 3 investigators, and a staff assistant. They're reviewing this case for racketeering enhancements. I blinked. "You think they'll get RICO charges if they can prove the HOA was being used as a front for coordinated fraud across state lines?" she said. "Then yes." And with the fake landscaping company in Georgia, the sham legal firm in Clearwater, and the forged insurance policy, it's looking more likely. For a long time, none of us said anything. The room was too quiet, the kind of silence you only hear when the weight of what's been done finally lands on everyone's shoulders. Later that night, I stood on my porch and looked out at the street. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement dark and gleaming under the porch lights. I could hear someone's wind chimes tinkling down the block, soft and irregular. For the first time in months, I didn't feel watched. No one was circling my stand. No one was lurking in the shadows with a phone ready to dial a complaint, but I also didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. The next morning, I was woken by a knock at 7 sharp. This time, it was the state investigator assigned to the Attorney General's task force. She was a tall woman with silver-streaked hair pulled into a tight braid and eyes that looked like they could drill through concrete. "Name's Patris," she said, flashing her badge. "I'm here to walk the property and verify some of the materials you submitted to our office." I invited her in and showed her the folder I'd been keeping. It had grown thick over the last few weeks' digital photos, hard copies of letters, and a full timeline of events compiled by Susan, cross-referenced with public records. Patris flipped through it methodically, making notes in a leather-bound journal. Every few pages, she paused to ask a question. Did anyone from the original board ever mention a vote on the legal retainer? No vote, I said. Marlene just declared they'd hired counsel, and that was that. Was the counsel ever seen at a meeting or contacted by other board members? Only emails from Marlene. The lawyer was her cousin. Never showed up in person. She nodded and wrote something with slow, deliberate strokes. When we reached the part about the graffiti incident, the night Rick sprayed food poison across my stand, she asked to see the footage again. I pulled it up on my laptop and let it play in silence. Afterward, she leaned back and studied me for a moment. You know, she said, most people would have packed up after something like this. I gave a small shrug. I figured if I didn't stand up, someone else was going to get crushed next. She closed the folder and stood. You might want to be at the courthouse next Wednesday. Preliminary arraignment starts at 9. There's a motion hearing after. Judge wants resident testimony. I promised I'd be there. The following week passed slowly, a waiting game of emails, notarized statements, and careful planning. The new board was working overtime to stabilize the HOA's budget, and Leela had taken over communication with the county's compliance office to make sure every regulation was being followed to the letter. We weren't just fixing what Marlene broke, we were building something better. On Wednesday, I showed up to the courthouse in a pressed shirt and slacks, a manila folder under my arm. The courtroom was quieter than I expected, filled mostly with attorneys and a few curious reporters. Marlene was already seated at the defense table, her posture stiff, hair pulled into a severe bun that made her look smaller than I remembered. When the judge entered, the room stood. The proceedings began with a reading of the charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of financial records, and operating a criminal enterprise under the guise of a nonprofit organization. Her attorney, a man with a voice like dry paper, pled not guilty on all counts. But the prosecutor wasn't fazed. He stood and handed the judge a binder so thick it required both hands. These materials include financial records from 3 states, testimony from over 20 residents, and digital evidence directly linking the defendant to each of the fraudulent entities. We are requesting that Miss Whitaker be remanded without bail. Her attorney protested, of course, citing her age, her dedicated community service, and lack of prior convictions. But then Patris stood up from the gallery and handed the judge a supplemental affidavit. The judge scanned it, his expression unreadable. Motion granted. Bail denied. That was the end of it. No shouting, no outburst, just a hollow expression crossing Marlene's face as the bailiff stepped behind her chair. When I left the courtroom, there were people waiting outside, neighbors, mostly, some of whom I hadn't seen in months. They didn't ask questions. They just nodded. Some clapped me on the shoulder. Someone handed me a thermos of coffee and said it was from Susan. The next day, I opened my stand again. The market had grown now, not just my table, but 2 others beside it. Charles had started offering homemade jams, and the Jenkins family brought fresh bread loaves wrapped in brown paper. We weren't running a business. We were building a community. There were no more complaints. No more fines. Just families walking from house to house, laughing, talking, picking up a jar of honey or a bag of radishes on the way to the park. Later that month, the new board passed a resolution. Residents could use their own property for small-scale, state-approved cottage operations without requiring additional HOA approval. The vote was unanimous. But the real victory came the following spring when a young couple moved into the house across from mine. They walked over during my Saturday setup, curious about the stand. The woman smiled as she scanned the jars on the table. "We heard about this neighborhood," she said. "The farmer's market, the community, it's why we chose it." The man added, "We used to live in a place with a nightmare HOA. Heard you all cleaned house. I looked around at the block kids playing chalk games on the sidewalk, an elderly neighbor walking his dog, the sound of someone hammering in a garden trellis down the street. Yeah, I said, we cleaned house. And this time we were keeping it that way.